name is Gary, and about a year ago I put out a video called Knee Plica and Reincarnation. And in that video, I tried to lay out a case for the fact that human reincarnation is actually taking place on people's knees. And since that time, I've learned a lot more about this incredible subject, and I'm going to try my very best to share all the information with you in this video. So at first you might say, how is it possible that people could be reincarnated back to life on knee bones? Well, if you were able to take a look at actual bones of the knee, and that would be like a femur bone, which is your thigh bone, or a patella, which is your kneecap. And if you looked at the actual bone with a magnifying glass, you're going to see the remains of snails. And these snails are special snails. They're known as limpets. And I believe their role is to bring people back to life with their tongue. And I'll get into that later in this presentation. When you're looking at the idea of snails living on your knee, and you look up the word patella. Now, patella is your kneecap, and you go to Wikipedia, look up patella, it'll say the patella, also known as the kneecap, is a flat, circular, triangular bone which articulates with the femur. But the same word, you look up patella under Wikipedia, and it'll say patella, gastropod. And it says, if you go down to Wikipedia, it says patella is a genus of sea snails with gills, typical true limpets, marine gastropod mollusks in the family Patellidae, the true limpets. So you see, hidden right in plain sight is that fact. And also, if I can get there, I want to look up the word knee. If you look up the word knee, if you go to a good etymology dictionary, Etym Online, and you look up N-E-E, you leave off the K, N-E-E, it'll say knee. Born, it'll say to be born is the definition there. That's really interesting. You see, born. And also another word, it says to be born, it says past participle of nasi and natri. And these are connected to a word that I believe is called nacreous. And if you look up nacreous, nacreous is mother of pearl. And mother of pearl is a secretion of mollusks. So it's very, very fascinating. We're going to take a moment out and look at pictures of limpets on Google. And as we're doing that, I'm going to go to Etym Online and look at the origin of the word limpet. And when you see limpet, you'll see that it says type of marine gastropod mollusk. And earlier, a limpet, L-E-M-P-E-T, and then it says originally meant a lamprey. Now, a lamprey is a different animal, but it's interesting that it originally meant lamprey, the word lamb and prey. And then from late Latin, lampetra. And of course, petra is stone or rock. So there is an interesting connection with rocks. And I'm going to get into that later with the Bible, some of the Bible verses with rocks. But for now, we're just going to look at something else called lapidus. And you'll see lapidus means stony, a pebble, a bare rock mountain, and also limpet right there. And, you know, why is that important? Because you look at the idea that limpets are connected with rocks and stones. And you look at the, the idea of the masons that are supposedly running, in charge, are connected to this rocks and stones. And there's another connection when you look at lapidary. You see the word is almost the same, lapidary. It says one skilled in working with precious stones. And the stones might very well be people, because remember, people have birthstones. So people probably are born out of the shell or the stone of a limpet. So that's very interesting. You go to also limpet on Wiktionary, and it says derived from lambo, which means I lick, and then plus petra, stone. So I lick and stone. That's the main definitions of this limpet. And licking is interesting. You go to LIC, and you put in LIC under Etym Online, and that takes you to lich, L-I-C-H. And of course, that says dead body, corpse. So in other words, these these limpets lick people back to life with the radula. Now the radula is the tongue inside the mouth of a limpet, and when you look at it closely, it looks like a shimmering gold chain. And also the word radula is important because we're going to look at the idea that the limpet is actually the scarab. So we're going to go to edomonline.com, and you'll see, you look up scarab, and it says scarab, black dung beetle, held sacred by the ancient Egyptians, from Middle French scarabée, and it says carabus beetle. And what we're going to do now is we're going to look up the symbolism of a scarab and see if it's similar to a limpet. We're going to go to scarab. So we're just going to Google something called scarab symbolism, and you get something that says, in ancient Egyptian religion, the scarab was also a symbol of immortality, resurrection, transformation, and protection, much used in funerary art. The life of the scarab beetle revolved around the dung balls that the beetles consumed, laid their eggs in, and fed their young, represented a cycle of rebirth. Also, when you Google scarab represents, you get something that says the scarab represented the sun god Ra that rolled across the sky each day. So, of course, when you look at a limpet, in the limpet's mouth, you have something called the Radula. And the Radula, as I mentioned, is the tongue that's like a gold tongue. It's a gold chain. Looks like a gold chain, but it's a tongue. And when you look at radula, if you go to Wikipedia, it'll say the radula is an anatomical structure used by mollusks for feeding, sometimes compared to a tongue. It is minutely toothed chitinous ribbon, which is typically used for scraping or cutting food before the food enters the esophagus. So essentially, the sun god Ra is the radula, which is the tongue of the limpet, and that rolls out and brings back new life, and that new life gets regenerated inside the limpet. And that's, in a way, if you look at the tongue and you look at a piece of motion picture film, you're going to see a lot of similarities. Remember, a motion picture film is tiny little people, like trapped in a motion picture film, but if you have a motion projector, you project it onto a screen, and all of a sudden the people are large. So on your leg, you'll have limpets, and you'll have tiny little images of people that are brought back to life with the limpet's tongue, the radula. And when we go back to edomonline.com, we've looked up scarab, and on that same page, you go down and it says escargot. It says snail, edible snail. And it also says, and French seems to have been influenced by words related to scarab. So you see there's a connection with scarab and snails right away. There's, right on Edom Online. And when you're looking at the radula again, and if you look at the word Tinseltown, so Tinseltown is what Hollywood is called, Tinseltown. And you go to Edom Online, you look up tinsel, T-I-N-S-E-L. It says kind of cloth made with interwoven gold or silver thread, and this says meaning very thin sheets or strips of shiny metal. And that's what the tongue of the radula is, shiny metal. So there's a tremendous connection between the radula and motion picture film. And one last thing about that is that when you're looking at the word radula, it seems to imply that the radula is like a file, and if you unscramble the word file, it says life. So it's really another connection to the life actually starting on the tongue of a limpet. So very briefly, when you look at pictures of the knee, you'll see the knee consists mainly of 4 bones. One is the patella, which is your kneecap, and then there's the femur, and the femur articulates with the kneecap. And the femur is also called your thigh bone. And then underneath that, you have the tibia and the fibula. And some people actually have a 5th bone. It's a small bone called the fibella. It's a sesamoid bone. But essentially, the 2 bones that I'm going to be focusing on is the patella and the femur, and the images that those 2 bones create in a way. So when you start looking at this, you'll see a connection with limpet and the word lamb, and also with sheep, because lamb is a sheep, and you look at the idea of sheep, and you might say, well, how could all this be happening? How could this be possible? And then the tiny snails living there and reincarnating people and not know. Well, there is supposedly something that I did in my first video about what's called plica, and plica is knee plica. And if you look up knee plica, that's supposed to be what's on your knee, where I'm explaining that there are snails there. And it says a plica, if you just Google it, it says a plica is a fold in the thin tissue that lines your knee joint. Most people have 4 of them in each knee. They let you bend and move your leg with ease. Well, yeah, there is probably some tissue that's made of actually stem cells, which is really interesting, that this tissue is stem cells. But essentially, whenever you look up the word plica, you always get the fact that it's a fold. And when you look up fold, if you go to dictionary.com and you look up fold and you go down, go there. And I have a slow connection. Sorry, folks. My computer's always slow here. That's okay. So you look up fold, and it says a flock of sheep. The sheep kept within it. Also a church. So you have a connection with the sheep. And with anything, if you look up the word news, I'm not going to get involved with that right now, but EWS, or it's spelled EWES, and EWEU, I think it's pronounced, is sheep. So, everything pretty much in our reality, in a way, has to do with the knee. Also, it's in the synovial membrane. And when you look up synovial, you'll look at the word and it'll say sun, like you could break it down on Wiktionary, it'll say sun eggs. But ovial has a lot to do with ovis, and ovis is sheep. So there's a lot of connections with sun and sheep. And when you look up heliculture, which is what snail farming is, heliculture, heli is sun, right? Heli is sun. It also has to do with helix, which is fascinating. But heli is sun, and when you look up heli, it's another word for holy. And if you look up, say, Hollywood, holly is another terminology for holy in a way, which I'll get involved in a little later on. So that's some interesting connections there. And again, back to what's going on. And inside the mouth of the limpet is what's called the radula. And the radula, if you look, it's a chain. And I'll try to bring up some images of that. So when you look at the fact that the limpet has in its mouth like a gold chain, and you look at something called, on Wikipedia, you can go to what's called Great Chain of Being. Okay, you'll see some pictures there. And the Great Chain of Being, it says the Great Chain of Being is a hierarchical structure of all matter and life thought in medieval Christianity to have been decreed by God. The chain starts with God and progresses downward to angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals. And again, this chain is inside these limpets that live on your knee. It's really fascinating if you look at the chain. And then if you look at something called paternoster, and it has to do with the rosary, it has a lot of connections there too. And I'm not, I'm being honest here, that these lambs, these loving little creatures, they tend to be chosen by the Creator probably to reincarnate people. I'm not even interested in science fiction, folks. I mean, if you know about me, I'm not really. This is not science fiction. But if you look at paternoster, it happens to also be a special elevator, not just the rosary. And then the elevator is probably based on the inside mouth of a snail. So when you look at the fact that the radula is a strap or ribbon, and you look at the word reincarnation, and reincarnation, and if you look it up on dictionary or Edom Online, the first part of that word is rein, R-E-I-N. And you go to rein, and I'm on actually Edom Online. And a rein is a strap fastened to a bridle strap, bond, back, retenir, hold back. It says hold back. To give something free rein. So the idea of rein is to pull back. You know, to pull back, to bring you back, to pull you back is the reins inside the mouth of the snail. So in this section, I want to talk to you about the images that you'll probably find out there if you research and search the internet. But you could look on Wikipedia. You just type in patella under kneecap, and you'll see on Wikipedia there's an actual photograph of a kneecap of a deceased person. And if you enlarge that as large as you can, you're going to see images like the paintings on the patella that are done by these limpets, by the snails. They secrete or excrete out drawings or paintings. And these paintings, if you also go to a star chart under Wikipedia, you'll see an old illustration of the sky charts of the little figures that represent stars. And you'll see it's like there's the universe is on your knees. You know, the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere, like the two kneecaps. And if you look at one of the major star charts, one of them is called Caduceus. It's the whale. And you'll see it's like a giant whale constellation with its tongue out. It's really a frightening. And then if you look at the patella, the actual patella, you'll see something really just about as frightening in a way. When you're not careful, it'll really jolt you. And so you'll blow up the images, and then you'll see like Aquarius as well, where it's probably on, if you compare it to the star charts. So essentially the universe is on your knees, and you know, I really believe that if as you're walking, it's creating the images. These snails are like creating images that are like a hologram or a three-dimensional picture. And again, if there was a way to put cameras in the knees, you're going to actually see the universe come to life. And also, it's very biblical. The Bible, the terminology for Bibles and stuff, I'm going to talk to you in the next little section. As I said earlier in the video, that I actually have a cast of a femur bone, and it picks up a lot of the detail of a real bone because it's casted from a real bone. And if you take a magnifying glass to the bone and you look closely, there are, of course, little people that are living on your knee, or at least the residue of people are left. And of course, that has to do with the way the snail reincarnates people back. And this also is going to be very biblical. It has a lot to do with the Bible. And again, first off, I'm not saying the Bible didn't happen as a historical, proof, as a way, as history, but I'm saying there's a way we could actually prove the Bible being 100% accurate. If of course cameras were somehow put in the knee, as I said, you could probably see the Bible come to life as a living motion picture. And when you look at words that are in the Bible, and if you look at the word for limpet also means stone or rock. If you look at that, I think I talked about that earlier. And if you look at the way the Creator is described in the Bible, a lot of times it's with the rock terminology, and I'll try to get to that right now. Deuteronomy chapter 32. Verse 4, he is the rock, his work is perfect. And then you go down to Deuteronomy 32:18, and it says, of the rock that begot thee. You go to Samuel 2, chapter 2, verse 2, there is none holy as the Lord, for there is none beside thee, neither is there any rock like our God. And while I'm searching, I just, of course, want to make sure that people realize I'm not saying the Bible didn't actually happen in reality. I'm saying that it happens on your knees right now, in a way that we could follow. And that would be the same for other religions too. I mean, if you're born and you're a Hindu or something, I'm sure you could find the story there for Hinduism. I'm not an expert on any other religion, or I'm not an expert on this religion either. I'm just looking up words here. So let's go to so go to 2 Samuel chapter 22, verse 2. And he said, the Lord is my rock and my fortress. And I'll just do a couple more. I'm going to go to Psalms. I think Psalms had some good ones in there. If I could find Psalms chapter 18, verse 2. The Lord is my rock and my fortress. And then there's, I think I'll do one more. Chapter 27, verse 5. And they'll say at the end, he shall set me upon a rock. And again, these are really, in a way, shell secretions or limpet secretions, because when you look at the word testament, testa means shell. It could mean skull, but it also means shell. If you look and then meant, and you look up mantle, mantle is where the secretions come from, and you just search where that word comes from, mantle and mensch, it's very close. So you have testament there. New Testament and the Old Testament is 100% accurate, and it's on your knees. I also want to talk to you about how people are described in the Bible. When you look at how they're made or how they're described, and if you look, they're mostly described as images and as dust and ashes. And if you look at the idea, if you go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, and it says, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. And the word like also, if you look, it's a very interesting word. If you look up L-I-C, it means death. I don't have the words right in front of me, but it's something like that. And then remember, these are liquors. These limpets are lick, and they lick you back somehow with the radula, the tongue. And so it's interesting connection. Now, also, when you look at the motion picture industry, which is all about this, and you look at the word flicks, L-I-C-K-S, it's all about that as well, the reincarnation. And there's a lot about images that are really fascinating. And so we're going to look at another word. We're going to look at image again on Genesis chapter 5, verse 3. It says, and Adam lived 130 years and begat a son in his own likeness, after his image, and called his name Seth. Remember, when you're looking at this and you see these tiny images on your knee, you're going to see images, and then if you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, people are also described as dust, as being made from dust. It says, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground. So that's also very interesting. And then when you look at also ashes, now ashes are interesting because that's what it's all about in a way. It's like you're being, or your ancestors are being reincarnated from your stem cells. They're being, I guess these snails, they eat your stem cells, or they gnaw at the stem cells on your bones, and they reincarnate you back. And if you look at Genesis chapter 18, verse 27, really interesting. It says, and Abraham answered and said, behold now, I have taken upon me to speak unto the Lord, which am but dust and ashes. Very interesting stuff. We're going to look up another word. If you search on King James Version and you type in the word worm, you're going to get some really amazing Bible verses. And one of them is Job chapter 25, verse 6. It says, "How much less man that is a worm, and the Son of Man, which is a worm." Son of Man, which is a worm. That's really interesting. And because when you look at the snail, there's a lot of connections with worms. And there's something called snail fever for one, and snail fever actually is like a virus in snails that produce these type of parasitic worms that have a male and a female stuck together. It's absolutely fascinating stuff, and that could be a lot of the Bible seems to be where there's twins being born. And then if you look at a snail, you go to if you look at something a snail has, it's called an odontophore. And it's like a cartilage under the radula. And the radula is the strap that reincarnates people back to life. But the odontophore, somebody's posted some nice pictures on Flickr about how the odontophore seems to show two worms, one on one side of the radula and one on the other side of the radula. And that's fascinating. And right away you could look at pictures of Kundalini and you'll see some connections there as well. And when you're looking at this image, try to compare it to symbols used by the medical institutions. And one of them is called the Rod of Asclepius. And the Rod of Asclepius is also called the Star of Life. And when you see an ambulance drive by, look on the ambulance. You'll see this symbol of a worm wrapping itself around a rod, and it's used by a lot of the medical institutions. And another symbol that's very similar to this one is called the Caduceus, and the Caduceus is two serpents or snakes wrapping itself around a rod. And this looks very similar to the odontophore and the radula inside the snail's mouth. So very, very interesting stuff. And of course, if you can get hold of a good femur bone or a cast of a femur bone, you're going to see the remains of something like this on the bone. Not exactly, but very similar to this symbol here. More Bible word I want to look at, and that's a word called dissolved. So when you look up King James Version and you go to Psalms chapter 75 verse 3, it says, "The earth and all the inhabitants thereof are dissolved. I bear up the pillars of it." So that has a lot to do with the snail too, because the snail's teeth are called the radula. It's like the tongue. And they're constantly being remade and dissolved. The teeth are like film, and they just get dissolved, and new teeth are constantly being made. So that has a very good connection there as well. And then you go down to Isaiah chapter 25, verse 19. It says, "The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved." So there's some interesting, and here Isaiah chapter 34 verse 4, it says, "And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll." So that tongue does roll up, like a scroll if you look. So I'm not saying, of course, I'm just saying that the way we could understand it is the tongue of the snail. Very interesting. So in this last section, I do want to touch on the motion picture industry and its connection with reincarnation. But also, when you look into just about anything, you'll see a connection with this idea that people are being reincarnated by snails. So what I want to do is focus on the word Hollywood, which is a very interesting word. And if you look up Holly, it has a lot to do with to prick, and it also has to do with holy. Those words are part of the meaning of holly. And if you look up Wikipedia and you go to holly, you'll see holy there as one of the definitions. That's interesting because if you look up a word called heliculture or heliculture, that is about snail farming. heliculture. And when you look up Heli, it's another word for holy. So that's an interesting connection right there. So when you look up wood, you'll get a variety of different meanings for wood. And a couple of them you find on dictionary.com. You'll see that saying that wood means wild, as with rage or excitement, or mad or insane. And you'll see that on edomonline.com, as well as spiritually aroused. And remember that a snail shell, when you look at a spirit and you look at the word spirit, it has spire in it. And spire, if you look at spire, a spire is a part of the coiled shell of mollusks. The spire consists of all the worlds except for the body world. So also when you look up the word odontophore, it'll say a projection in the mouth of most mollusks that supports the radula. Now remember, the radula is like a bandsaw. It kind of scrapes at your bones, gnawing and probably eating stem cells and then reanimating you with your stem cells back in the mouth. So odontophore says a projection in the mouth. And then if you look up the word forest, odontophore, and you look up foresty, almost like forest, you go to edomonline.com and it says foresty, association between organisms in which one is carried on the body of another but is not a parasite. So there's another connection to forest in a way, and that's quite interesting. And also when you look up the Latin word for Hollywood, you get sanctum nemus. And when you look up nemos, it says a grove or a glade, a pasture, wood, okay? But if you look up a word that's almost identical, and that's spelled C-N-E-M-I-S, nemus, it's pronounced the same way, it'll tell you the section of the leg from the knee to the ankle. So that's another interesting connection there. And again, it's all about that area is where the snails that our Creator put in there, reincarnate us back. And the idea of Hollywood, getting people, mad or angry watching a film or scared or this, has a lot to do with the fact of mad and foaming at the mouth. Like these things probably are seeing what we see possibly. And in a way, it has a lot to do with the word rabies. I mean, the idea of foaming. And if you watch movies closely, you could see some of this like foaming at the mouth that takes place. Or the nose. It's really interesting. And when you're looking up wood under edomonline.com, you'll see that it has a lot to do with the name Odin, which is the German god. And you go to Odin under edomonline.com, and it says Odin, chief Teutonic god, the All-Father. And it says also to blow, inspire, spiritually arouse, and it says see wood. So what's incredible about this part is that when you blow up the image of the patella that's on Wikipedia, and you'll see that image of Caduceus, the large whale with its tongue out of the eye, one of the eyes of the whale, you'll see Odin. It'll look just like Odin. If you look at the pictures of Odin on Google, and you look at this, it looks like a magical wizard coming out of the eye of the whale. So it's incredible. So what is Hollywood? Hollywood could very well be snail secretions. And when you're looking at the knee again, you're looking at the odontophore, and a reminder, the odontophore is the cartilage under the radula. And in that cartilage, if you look at pictures on Flickr, as I mentioned, you'll see there it looks like two serpents or two worms on either side of the, one worm on one side of the radula and one worm on the other side. And that looks a lot like the ideas of Kundalini. And I believe that if you study this, you'll see that there's a possibility that our ancestors' ashes live in these worms. And the idea of the word cinema or cinematic, and if you look up sin, or incineration or sin, it seems to have a lot to do with ashes. And ematic also has a lot to do with vomiting up ashes. And that is why Hollywood has all these, crazy movies. It's probably a way to make these snails or the snail worms, vomit out the ancestors onto the patella. Just a couple of other quick points about Odin and Hollywood. You look up a word called Odeon, and Odeon means an ancient Greek or Roman building used for performances of music and poetry, a modern theater or concert hall. And you look up Odeon, and Odeon was a chain of movie houses. It still exists, and it was a huge chain of movie cinemas. And there's a lot of connection. Also, when you're looking at Hollywood, the Hollywood Hills or the Hollywood sign sits on Mount Lee. And Mount Lee is named after Don Lee. And there's another connection because Don Lee and the Odontophore. And the fact that Lee is a key name because when you're looking at Lee and you're looking at mother of pearl, and mother of pearl is the secretions of mollusks. It's what the mollusk secretes, an interesting mother of pearl. It also means dregs. And if you get like a bottle of apple cider vinegar, it'll a lot of times say with the mother, and it floats to the bottom, the sediment. And that's a lot of times what Lee is, or lees are described as sediments floating to the bottom of wine. So there's a tremendous connection, a symbolic connection with naming the Mount Lee. Of course, there's also the original kind of Hollywood was in New Jersey. That's where motion picture industry started. In a way, that's where it was really getting underway. And that was at a place called Fort Lee. So that's very interesting, the word Lee. So when you look up the idea of, a lot of this has to do with also the word whelk, W-H-E-L-K. Whelk is very close to the word walk. If you look up the whelk, you'll have a lot of different spellings of whelk. And whelk is a snail. And walk is very important to religion. If you look up halakha, it says, is the collective body of Jewish religious laws derived from the written and oral Torah. And then it finds out the meaning of halakha. It says, down here it'll tell you, it means to walk. So it's very interesting. And also in Hollywood, you have the Hollywood Walk of Fame. So we've looked at the Hollywood Walk of Fame, which is on the sidewalks of Hollywood Boulevard. And again, the connection with walk and whelk we've talked about. We've also looked at the Hollywood sign, which is sits on Mount Lee. And remember, the Hollywood sign sits on a mound of dirt. And I believe that is symbolic to the fact that when you look at Lee, and you'll see the idea of lees and mother of pearl is very similar. The idea of secreting or defecating some nacreous fluid out of the mantle of a snail. And now we're going to look at another part, another big attraction of Hollywood, and that's called the Grauman's Chinese Theater. And it's a very big a tourist attraction. It's a really nice place. It's a wonderful motion picture house. And outside in the forecourt, there's big slabs of concrete. And all these famous actors and actresses, they press their hands and their feet into the, or shoes into the concrete, and they make an impression. And that concrete is something very, very important, and I believe it has something to do with the word called ambergris. And when you go to etymology dictionary, Etymonline, you look up ambergris, and it says ambergris, gray amber. And remember, amber has a lot to do with embers and ashes and resin. And it says a wax-like substance of ashy color, found floating in tropical seas, a morbid secretion from the intestines of the sperm whale. So when you read about ambergris, you'll see that it has a lot to do with puke or excrement of a sperm whale. And you'd say, how is it possible this would have anything to do with Hollywood? And you look up pictures of ambergris and you read about it on Wikipedia. And there's a lot of interesting stuff there. It says that it's very valuable for the perfume industry. And remember, Hollywood is entertainment. And when you look up a word called entero, first part of entertainment, entero, it says intestine. Intestine from Greek entron, an intestine, piece of gut. So you see right away there is that connection with this ambergris. And we're going to look a little bit more at another word that's going to solve a lot of this. And that word is called busk, B-U-S-K. So you look up busk, and it says busk, strip of wood, whalebone. See that? And then you go down to a word called busker, and busker says itinerant entertainer. So right away you see a connection between wood and whalebone and the entertainment industry. And remember, on your knee you have a whale. It's called Caduceus. And I believe that image is coming out of the odontophore. And inside the odontophore is actually, that's part of a serpent. It's one of the serpents that lives inside of the snail. And the idea, again, I've said this earlier, the idea of Hollywood is to get these serpents or worms to eject out ashes. And these ashes could very well be that ambergris. And that ambergris, remember, is from a sperm whale. So it actually is, eventually can become men's sperm in a way that actually can produce real babies. And these babies could be, in other words, your grandparent or your grandfather or grandmother coming back again. That starts out on the knee of the person. And if you're open to the idea that the earth is a living organism, and you hear about the term Mother Earth, and you can look at something on Wikipedia or Google search this. It's called the world turtle, and it's the idea that the earth is actually on the back of a tortoise shell. And it might sound a little funny at first, but when you start looking at this and you look up the word tortoise or turtle, you'll see that actually that just means shell, that it's on the back of a shell because it says testa under tortoise. And testa, remember, testament. So the idea that we are living on the back of a snail shell is very possible. And because remember, the earth has different layers. So it has an inner core, an outer core, a mantle, and a crust. And that word mantle stands out because when you're looking at a snail, that's what a snail has. A snail has a mantle, and the mantle secretes the shell. So it's very possible that the earth is actually living on a snail. Thank you very much.